Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Brewer's Minute. So this week, we're going to talk about a really important and I think undercovered or underrated topic when it comes to building decks, and that is revisions. And for me, my background comes from kind of the arts. I was a creative writing major for a while in college. I used to play music and write songs and be in bands. So that's kind of my history that led up to my involvement in the Magic community and working at Goldfish. So the way I look at deck building is actually really similar to writing a short story or writing a song in some ways. And one of the things that was impressed into me by musicians I knew and played with, by professors in creative writing classes, was that when you're writing a song or a short story, it's never really done. Like, you might play that song on stage, you might read that story or publish that story, but even once that happens, there's always room for improvement. You never reach the state where it's perfect and it's over with. You can always make it better, always improve more. And Magic decks are the same way. You might play a deck you brewed at an F&M or at a GP, but that doesn't mean that that deck's done with and over with. There's always more you can do and improve in that deck. So revising, constantly revising, updating, making as good as it possibly can be is one of the key aspects to deck building. So we have a really good example of this from this week's Budget Magic deck. So this is the Marvelous Paradox deck, and it provides a really good example of how going through these revisions, you kind of almost have a first draft and a second draft, and you keep updating and solving problems and strengthening a paragraph here or there and updating the wording in this sentence and switching this around, and how that leads to the finished product. And by finished, I mean the deck we played in the videos. It's not that this deck is over with and I'll never change it again, but the deck that was finished enough to be our Budget Magic videos. So I want to just go through kind of my process with this specific deck as an example of how going through revisions leads to a finished quote-unquote deck. So a quick reminder before we break down the deck: if you enjoy Brewer's Minute and the other series here on the channel, it would be amazing of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So, with the Paradox Marvel deck, the whole thing started with an idea. I mentioned this in the article. I got past an Aetherworks Marvel in a draft, and I started thinking about how sweet it would be if we could use it multiple times a turn. And my mind immediately went to Paradox Engine, a card I'm really familiar with, I really love, and it was very obvious that these two cards work together. So that was kind of step one. This is like the foundation, the idea, the inspiration for everything that would come after. So after realizing that I wanted to build a deck around these two cards, I started looking for enablers. And as we go through this process, the revision process, you'll see that each of these steps is kind of a fork in the road, so to speak. So as we go to the next revision, the next step, we're at this point where if things go well and we can find an answer and the right cards are available, we go one direction, which allows us to keep working on the deck, keep improving the deck till it eventually becomes a playable deck. On the other hand, if one of those questions or the fork in the road goes the other direction, we might just have to scrap the whole thing. Maybe the idea doesn't work, and that does happen. You'll have ideas. It's very possible that I could have found Aetherworks Marvel and Paradox Engine and realized that there just weren't enough enablers to make it work, and then I would shelve that idea, keep it in the back of my mind. Maybe in Amonkhet, something comes out that enables this combo, and maybe the set after that, or maybe in Modern. So the idea is still there. Aetherworks Marvel and Paradox Engine will still work together, but sometimes you gotta, put it on the back burner and wait for something else to come along to realize the potential of the idea. So we have this synergy. The next step was finding enablers, and I immediately found, searching for energy, that we had enablers. We had enough enablers that we could make this deck work. Aethertide Whale, Free Spin. We talked about this during the deck tech, so I'm not going to go over it all, but basically, we had a total of 12 cards with Aethertide Whale, Pima Aetherseer, and Aether Windbasker that would be free spins of our Aetherworks Marvel. And this was enough to make me think, okay, this could work. We have the synergy, the combo we're building around. We have enough enablers. If I had searched for this effect, the free spin off Aetherworks Marvel effect, and found that we only had Pima Aether Seer, or only had Aethertide Whale, and the other cards weren't in the format, I probably would have went the other direction and said, alright, that was a cool idea, but we just don't have the support for it. But we found enough support, which means we go down the continue revising, continue building the deck path, and the next step in the original build of the deck was Chasm Guide. So I knew that I needed a way to give everything haste, and we have played Chasm Guide before, so I immediately thought, okay, Chasm Guide is the way we can actually close out the game. We spin the Aetherworks Marvel a bunch of times, get a bunch of whales and Aether Windbaskers. At the end of this chain, we hit Chasm Guide, everything gets haste, and we attack. So this was kind of the first draft of the deck. We went through these iterations, and this was, other than a bunch of random energy producers, this was the foundation of the deck. So I played a couple games with this deck and started to realize there were a couple of issues. The idea worked. The ability to keep activating Aetherworks Marvel with Paradox Engine, that was fine. The enablers were pretty good, although one of the problems was we fizzled a bit more than I would like. The problem was we were only getting our energy back. In the best case, Aethertide Whale got us back the energy we spent, so we literally had to hit with every single Aetherworks Marvel activation, or we would fizzle. And that's just not practical. Even with 12 hits in our deck, we had 4 Aether Windbaskers at that time, even with 12 hits, we're not always going to hit one. Sometimes we're going to get land, Puzzle Knot, and Servant of the Conduit, and we're only going to get back 3 energy when we need 6 to keep going. So that was one problem that I realized that to really realize the potential of this deck, we would have to overcome. The other problem is Chasm Guide itself, and this one was a lot easier to fix. So Chasm Guide, the problem is sometimes we would hit it early in our combo, and we wouldn't really have a choice but to get it, and then we're not giving everything haste because it only triggers when it enters the battlefield. So I actually thought back to Limited again and remembered this horrible common that I had gotten beat down with and thought, wow, maybe what we should be doing here is playing Spontaneous Artist. Like, yes, it costs energy, but that's okay. As long as we can build up enough energy, it doesn't matter if we hit Spontaneous Artist with our first flip of our Aetherworks Marvel. At the end of our combo, once we have all our whales and baskers and all that stuff, we can just dump our energy into giving all those things haste and attack. So this problem was easily solved. And this wasn't a true fork in the road problem. If Spontaneous Artist wasn't a card, I would have played the deck with Chasm Guide, and it would have been weaker, but it would have been okay. And there probably would be other answers to this problem too, like an extra turn spell or something. So we could have found another answer, but this was a revision that made the deck more powerful and more consistent. The second problem with consistency and fizzling mid-combo was a bit harder to solve, and I actually went through a couple of revisions before finding it. So one of the big debates I had in this deck was Rogue Refiner or Whirler Virtuoso in the 3-drop slot. Both of them produce energy. They both have different upsides. Whirler Virtuoso makes more energy, which is nice. If we're not going to get 6 energy back with a Marvel hit, getting 3 is helpful because that means 2 3s equals 6. Rogue Refiner, we technically need 3 of them to get back our 6 energy from Marvel. The other thing about Whirler Virtuoso is it has the ability to make Thopters. So when I was stuck with this somewhat kind of inconsistent build, one of the first draft builds where we fizzled a little too much, one of the things I thought was, well, maybe what we do is we go all in on Whirler Virtuoso and add another combo to the deck. So we already have Whirl of Invention, so we can add a couple more, add in a Gonti's Aetherheart, add in a Panharmonicon, play 4 Whirler Virtuosos, and then kind of as a backup, we have this Infinite Thopter combo where we make a Thopter with Virtuoso, we get energy with Gonti's Aetherheart, keep going, and we can win that way. We can find it with Aetherworks Marvel, we can tutor it up with Whirl of Invention. So this was kind of the second or third draft of the deck. I guess third if you count the Chasm Guide, Spontaneous Artist shift, which happened pretty early as another like independent revision. So this was a revision. I played a couple games of that, and it actually worked worse. It didn't do what I wanted to do. It weakened our Etherworked Marvel flips. Panharmonicon wasn't great but on its own. Neither was Gonti's Etherheart. Sometimes we draw them, and when we wanted better energy producers and all kinds of things. Another consideration was Whirler Virtuoso was worse on our mana, and since we were a budget deck, we don't have the good blue-red duels because they're super expensive. So we were less consistent mana-wise as well, where sometimes we'd have a harder time casting Whirler Virtuoso. So I scrapped that change. I tried it, it didn't work. We went back to where we were before, with Rogue Refiner being our 3-drop of choice. The problem is we were still kind of at the same place. We had the foundation of the deck. We had a combo that worked. We had enablers that worked pretty well. We had the haste finisher. Everything was very close. We were close to a build I was happy playing, but there was still just too much fizzling. We still had that energy problem where we needed to hit every single hit with Etherworks Marvel, and that was the last thing we needed to overcome. And this was the final fork in the road. And I honestly don't know if I hadn't found the answer to this problem, if I would have played this deck for Budget Magic. I was right on the fence. Like, it did really cool things sometimes, but we'd also do cool things and then still end up losing the game, which was really disappointing to get like 2 or 3 whales and then fizzle and then lose on the backswing. So I kind of shelved it a little bit for a day or two and was still thinking about it. It was still in the back of my head, and I knew that I had found every energy producer. Like, I looked through the list again and again. There wasn't another card that would make more energy. And then finally it struck me that maybe the solution wasn't another energy producer, but a cloning effect. A cloning effect would allow us to have another way to double up a whale, an Ether Windbasker. So I did a search for clones in Standard and immediately came up with Saheeli's Artistry and realized that was the perfect card for the deck for several reasons, but that was the revelation that made the deck good enough to be a Budget Magic video and for me to feel comfortable publishing it as a video, because it solved the problem. Now we had a card where we hit it on our Etherworks Marvel, and instead of just breaking us even with our energy, it would actually gain us energy, either by copying like Whale plus Puzzle Knot, or on the second one, double Whale, so we're doubling our energy, or late in the combo, a huge Ether Windbasker to gain even more energy. This was a card that was like an energy ritual, essentially, because of how it works. So once I started playing with this deck, I immediately knew. Actually, the first game you saw in Budget Magic was the very first game I played with the Saheeli Artistry build of the deck. It just immediately clicked, and I comboed off on turn 5 or whatever. It didn't feel even close to fizzling. It just felt so perfect. So I knew that we were at a point where the deck would actually work then. So that's kind of my deck building process, is you start with this idea, make sure there's enough enablers that you can even pursue the idea. If there's not, then you shelve the idea for the time being. Remember it. Maybe something happens in the future to make it work. And then you just keep going down the path and hitting these forks in the road. There's these problems you have to overcome. Can you find the right finisher? Can you find a way to solve the energy problem where you're getting enough energy? So every time you hit one of these forks, you're at a point where you either can figure out a revision that makes that overcomes that hurdle, and then you keep going with the deck, or maybe you still could shelve it. It's very possible that if Saheeli's Artistry wasn't a card, and I couldn't find a card that did something similar to that, that maybe I would have just shelved the deck. Like, that was kind of the final fork in the road for me, was solving this last problem. But with one more revision and having that card in the format, it was enough to push it over the top and be a really sweet combo and very consistent combo. So the point of all this is not only once you have your deck, but when you're building a deck, what you're really doing is just revising. You start with this idea, this inspiration, a sentence, so to speak, a paragraph, a writing prompt, and then you start to build off that. And as you go along, there's nothing wrong with realizing that this isn't the right story for you to tell right now, or the right song for you to write right now, and just scrapping that idea and moving on to something else. It's possible that we could have scrapped this deck and I would have came back to it in a month for Budget Magic and figured it out then. But you're constantly revising, and eventually you get to a point where you're happy enough with the deck that you're able to read it aloud to someone. You're able to play it at your F&M, play it at a GP or whatever. But like I said in the intro, that doesn't mean the deck is done. I'm still thinking about Marvelous Paradox. It's still in the back of my mind. I've moved on to other things, but it's still something I'm considering, and still something that I'm looking to improve. So it's possible that we figure out even another iteration, another revision that makes it even better. So that's basically how I view building decks. So as you're building your decks, just keep going down the path and revising, rewriting, going on to your second draft and third draft. You can't expect to have a finished deck on your very first build. Just like you don't expect to have your full novel on your first draft, or your full short story, your full essay that you're writing for a class. It's unreasonable to expect you just sit down and all of a sudden have this great epiphany and you write the great American novel, or build the next great Magic deck. That's just not how it works. So it's a process of working and revisions that gets you from this small idea, this small spark of inspiration, to the finished product that is something you're proud of. So keep working, keep updating, keep revising, and you can take even a small idea and make it into something that's super sweet. Anyway, that's been our Brewers Minute for this week. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.